as we look at Victorian era fashion, today we want to talk about what was the dark side of looking like a beautiful China doll. I'm Tiffany of Stitchin and I bring historical fashion to life so that you can live out your literary dreams. Since 2020, I've been making clothes inspired by what the marches would have worn in Little Women. And today, Ayana and I are back to explore the political influences on what the March sisters wore, specifically how the lack of legislative protections and the abuse of humans allowed Victorian fashion styles to flourish. Ayana of the Vintage Guidebook has joined me again for this journey and is here to share her expertise on fashion history with us.
Thanks for having me, Tiffany. My name is Ayana. I go by the Vintage Guidebook on all social media platforms. I love social and fashion history. I am a history student right now, and I love the way that fashion influences society, society influences fashion, how things impact one another, just all of it. And the 19th century is so much fun because we have so many different eras and different things going on. So happy to be here.
Absolutely, always a pleasure. We're going to continue exploring Victorian fashion and how her and her family wore the fashions and chose to protest some of them even. And for our beginning point, let's talk about that example in Little Women when Meg goes out and buys the silk and disappoints John. So we know Meg always had an eye for fine things, right? She always had to look like the fashionable women in the fashion plates of the era. And she is gadding about with Sally, and she finds this silk at a bargain. It's this beautiful silvery silk. And she buys 25 yards. And if you're a seamstress, you might be going, why would she buy 25 yards? There's no way she would need 25 yards to make a dress. Let me tell you something. First off, the technology of the day did not allow them to weave the fabric as wide as we can today. I can't remember the exact number, but I believe it was like 22 or 25 inches wide. So you have to keep in mind that it's about half as wide as what we're buying today, if you're buying 60-inch wide fabric. So cut that in half, you're looking at 12 or 13 yards. And then, of course, you're remembering this is during the age of the crinoline and the very full skirts. As well as I talk about in another video, she may have been planning to make two bodices, one for day and one for evening. And then when you look at that, 12 to 13 yards in today's measurements is about the right amount for that. But let's talk about the cost. John nearly loses it when he sees that it cost $50. So let's talk about what $50 is today. If you do a little bit of rough calculation, that is about $2,000. So no wonder she blew her budget and John was a little bit displeased.
Jeez.
That's like a wedding gown, right? I mean, I've made wedding gowns, historical wedding gowns for people that I didn't even have to spend $2,000 on the materials. But let's talk about something that was true during the era, right? Materials in general were more expensive then than they are now, but labor in general was cheaper then than it is now. And when you talk about fast fashion, it's kind of hard to believe. But in general, when you run the numbers and do the comparisons, that is generally how it broke out. So how was this? How did this happen? And what was influencing all of these elaborate, opulent fashions of the era? So we're looking specifically at Western fashion, the United States, the United Kingdom, and you've probably heard the sun never set on the British Empire, right? And this is in relation to the political power that was held by the British during the 19th century. This power was achieved mostly through colonization, giving the British access to many resources in their colonies, including labor. As a result, British fashion was very quick to adopt and adapt the fashions worn in the colonies and use the resources from the colonies to create more and more elaborate styles. As we mentioned in our Regency video about fashion is political, of course, this began even earlier with the wide adoption of the fine cotton muslins from India. And so you had the printed cottons, the muslins, the paisley shawls, all of those things were very popular from India during the Regency era. And then, of course, in the United Kingdom, they were trying to copy them. People could tell the difference usually, but if you couldn't afford the ones that were from India or there was a shortage, then you could, still look the part with the copycat, right? And so this idea of adopting these things from other cultures only grew throughout the Victorian era. And one of the ones that I don't know how to say this because it's frankly quite disturbing, but it's maybe a little bit funny if you look at it in the right way, is this little short story that was written by Anthony Trollope. It says, very many articles were asked for, looked at, and then not purchased. The first article demanded over the counter was a real African monkey muff, very superior, with long, fine hair. The ships which are bringing them have not yet arrived from the coast, answered Jones. They are expected in the docks tomorrow. And even though this was kind of a satire piece, sadly, this is true. This is in 1870, and real African monkey muffs were actually in demand. The colobus monkey, which was native to African forests, was hunted mercilessly for its distinctive black and white fur.
Oh, no. I was gonna ask, like, where does this end? It's probably extinct now, right? And yeah.
I haven't looked it up to be honest, but I would guess it's either extinct or endangered, kind of like the bird craze that happened here in the United States. And Audubon, he did all of his
Ugh.
work to try to save the birds, but women wanted birds on their hats, and so they killed them. This is just one small dark point of the fashion, right? There was many, many dark sides to it. And like we said, most of these things, many of these things are coming from the colonies, from other cultures. They're not originating in the United Kingdom or in the United States, right? So you've got silk coming from China, you've got ivory from African and Indian elephants, things that are adopted from those cultures. So you've got the big pagoda sleeves of the 1850s, inspired by China. You've got the Turkish bloomers that Amelia Bloomer wore that we talked about in a previous video. You have the influence of the Turks again on bolero style jacket. And then the aesthetic gowns that we mentioned in our previous video were often made from silks from East Asia. So you've got all of these things that are in fashion, in demand, and they're built off of these cultures that have been colonized and are being exploited by the British.
That's such a good point too, that as imperialism and colonialism kind of expand, you start seeing more and more of it influencing fashion, like definitely the chinoiserie phase, where you start taking all of these things that are Chinese or a lot of other East Asian, because we're not talking about India. That happened a little bit earlier with the Regency, but it keeps going, right? It doesn't
Right.
stop. Um, but you have, yeah, chinoiserie coming in and all of these different influences, while at the same time you have things like the Opium Wars going on, and England really just completely taking over and ruining things in China. And it's like, we're going to ruin you as a country, but we like your gowns. Those are nice. Can we have some of those, please?
Right.
And it's just one of those weird things.
Yeah, it's really sad when you look at it. And sadly, as we'll talk about in a little bit, there's still a lot of comparisons in today's world. It's not something that humans have stopped doing, sadly. Of course, there's also the influence of war on fashion. So you have the Crimean War, which began in 1853, and it distinctively influenced the fashion that Queen Victoria wore, which of course then influenced Western fashion. She definitely adopted some Turkish details into her clothing because the Turks were allies of the British during that war. And so there was, the rich colors, Turkish tassels, crescent brooches. And then last but not least, one more example of the British and taking things from other cultures is when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert purchased Balmoral Castle in 1852, she fell in love with the plaids. And so she began wearing plaid dresses, which of course we know that would then influence Western fashion. And if you look at dresses of the 1850s and the 1860s, plaid is predominant. There is a lot of plaid in the surviving dresses of the era, as well as in the surviving fashion plates of the era.
Yeah, we definitely see a big plaid boom in a way that we didn't see quite as much before. It was very much like that is a Scottish thing. Not that other cultures didn't have it, but like, let's be real, very, very big in Scotland. It's funny because the British Empire, as we think of it, like the UK, United Kingdom, is a Regency invention. 1801, yeah. We see them joined together, right? In
Right.
a way that before it was England doing this, England doing that, England, whatever. Now it's the United Kingdom, it's Britain as a whole, whereas before this was really limited to one country. So when you have that, it's really interesting that we start moving forward with this sense of Britishness. But what does that mean when England itself went around and assumed these other cultures into itself? And I mean, again, this is not one of my areas, but I would really like to know what the Scots at the time thought of that, of the subjugating monarchy now wearing your plaid and saying, oh, we're all British, it's fine now. I wonder if they thought it was a point of pride that she wanted to wear it, or if they thought, who are you to come in here? It's one of
Right.
those things again.
It's interesting you mentioned that because the contrast of a lack of plaid in the Regency era versus the amount of plaid in the Victorian era is striking. And I know this from like sewing historical dresses, which, by the way, if you want a historical dress, I make historical dresses made to measure. You can look me up at Stitchin Addiction. But when I source fabrics, right, I have to look at a lot of different factors to try to get fabrics that are as close as possible to the historical original fabrics. And one of the things that I learned early on was you might find the perfect fabric for a Regency dress, but if it's in a plaid, it's not very accurate. There are a few surviving plaids, but a lot of them are tied to like Scotland. And so there's
Yeah.
not a lot of plaids that were worn by the English, the French. So if you've watched our previous video on how political things influenced Regency fashion, you already know this, but let's review really quickly. New advances occurred at a very rapid pace during the Regency era and early Victorian era, and these new technological advances changed the spinning and the weaving process. So by the time Queen Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837, more and more cloth was being bought. It was being made in textile mills rather than being spun and woven at home and in small home businesses. And of course, you also know this from our previous video that cotton had become the cheapest textile due to the enslaved labor of the American South and the low paid labor of women and children in the textile mills, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Women were employed in the cheapest labor positions as well as children, and they were also paid less. They were paid between a half and a third of what a man would be paid, even if they were holding the same position. There's examples in this era of a man had the position, he was getting paid 28 shillings, and a woman would come in and get paid 8. So it was crazy, the difference in the pay. But regardless, women were working a lot in these factories, mostly just to make ends meet. And in 1896, toward the end of the Victorian era, there was over 1 million women working in the factories in England, almost 1.5 million.
Yeah, it sort of speaks to the idea of how readily these factories would employ women or children, that there were so many of them employed. It was one of the few jobs you could get that was still quote unquote respectable.
Right.
And well, compared to other things, I'm thinking of maybe like being a laundress or something like that, where the work doesn't really end. At least a factory has work hours. Granted, they're really long, but there is a point in which you will stop, at
Yes.
least.
Toward the end of the period, we had
Yes,
work hours. At the beginning, we did not have work hours. They could keep you on and make you work as many hours as they wanted. But yes, toward the end of the period, there was legislation introduced that limited the hours.
absolutely. And on that same note, also talking about wages, right? We don't have a minimum wage of any kind, a legal amount that a company has to pay you.
Right.
So you definitely have factories taking advantage of women and children and saying, well, this is how much we feel like paying you. And it just speaks to the desperation of the period. Well, the fact of the matter is, there were just way more poor people during this time. You have these people who can't make ends meet at all, having this factory job, having children have factory jobs, and barely piecing it together. There's no way that it was enough. And you wonder, well, why would people settle for such low pay? Well, because it's better than nothing, which
Absolutely.
was also a thing. Remember, in America, slavery doesn't end until 1865. So guess what? There is someone who will take that job, absolutely, not by their choice, but anyone can swoop in and say, you know what, you're asking for too much money. I can literally get someone to do this for free.
Right.
So it puts everyone in this cycle of exploitation with labor.
Right. And you have activists endeavoring throughout the entire period trying to bring these human right violations to justice and trying to get legislation in place and different things so that these things are not allowed to take place anymore. Of course, in the United States, we have the Civil War. And in 1865, after the war ended, the 13th Amendment finally abolished slavery. In both the United States and the United Kingdom, legislation began to be introduced to regulate pay, hours, and even the age of workers with limited success, depending on how well it was enforced. And of course, there were measures introduced that failed. People like Amelia Bloomer were involved in some of these. People like the Alcotts were involved in some of these issues. The Alcotts actually chose the clothing they would wear based on these issues. The time that they lived in the Fruitlands, they only wore linen. They refused to wear cotton because it was created by the labor of the enslaved. And they also believed in taking care of animals, so they didn't want to wear wool because that was taken from the sheep. And so they would only wear linen. However, you have to remember they're in Massachusetts, the winter is very cold. And so they had a very cold winters as a result. Fruitlands was an experiment that Bronson and some other families wanted to partake in. It ultimately failed. And that was one part of the experiment, was to wear only linen.
That's an interesting point too about the exploitation of labor and how we start getting all of these ideas about workers' rights. And it, well, not that it was the only time people thought about it, but it starts becoming something that you really have to address, that governments really have to address, because the question of slavery is there, right? The UK abolishes slavery in 1838. And they were very closely linked to the US until then. What were all of these cotton mills and other textiles and stuff like that in the UK, in England, Ireland, Scotland? Where did they get all that cotton from? They got most of it from America because it was so cheap to import when you have to pay your workers literally nothing, right? But then they abolish slavery, and then it starts to become socially unacceptable. Even the worst of the worst start to say, you know what? I think slavery is the line that I can't cross. I think that has to be the point that I cannot support this anymore. And so England sort of turns its back on the US a lot and says, we're no strangers to exploitation either, but that's a bit too far. We're not going to do business. And granted, activists and everything also pressuring the government. What happens though? England and the UK as a whole just turns its attention to India, to Egypt, to other colonial nations that it swallows up and
Mhm.
pays people just enough to say, well, we're not doing slavery anymore like the US. We're
Right.
not like the Americans. Don't worry about that. But they're still very much exploiting people to keep those rates down, to make sure that they can get their cotton. Because think about that too. Now you don't have to pay import fees. You're doing it all at home, right? All within the British Empire. And the US, unfortunately, is put in this very weird moral gray area where other countries, right, the British sun never sets in the British Empire. So
Oh,
who are they going to do business with? It's starting to look really bad. We already talked about France and their relationship with Haiti. So America looks really bad between like 1838 to 1865. And they start having to really address, okay, what are we going to do about labor?
right.
Slavery is looking increasingly like a problem internationally. Also, let's not forget there are still slave revolts, still
Yep.
people running away. It becomes sort of a ticking time bomb that someone
Mhm.
needs to address, and who's going to fill in that gap? The US, um, to its credit, has a lot of immigrants who then get treated very poorly.
Yep.
But that question of how much do we pay people for labor and still keep costs way, way down came up then and is still here with us today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm going to say, if you want more fashion tips, more fashion history, definitely make sure you are following Ayana at the Vintage Guidebook on all platforms. Of course, you also have the American Civil War influencing fashion, right? This was not just because women are showing support for the cause, but they're also having to do it from necessity, right? Women are having to dress simpler, they're having to reuse things. That is possibly how the invention of the waist began to be more of a thing, was women would make a blouse, they would call it a waist or a shirt waist, out of old skirts or old fabric or the little bit of new fabric they could get, but pair it with a skirt that they already had. There's also the rise of the Garibaldi blouse and the Zouave jacket. These are inspired by the Italian War in the United Kingdom. And then when the Italian unit here in the United States adopted this wear while they were fighting in the Civil War, some women also made it fashion to show their support for that. So I have an entire video that goes a lot more into detail about that fashion. If you would like it, it's right here for you to watch. And I will not go into further detail on that in this since I've already gone over it in a different video. Since the Regency era, as we mentioned, textiles, of course, are becoming cheaper due to these improved technologies, but colors are still limited. Until the mid 19th century, pretty much all dyes were natural, and these dyes were also fugitive, which means that they didn't stay. Okay, so they might look really pretty when you first got the fabric and when you first made your outfit, but then they would eventually fade. I can't remember what color it was. I read this one time and I wish I could remember the color, but it's like a really pretty color, maybe like purple or something, and it would fade into this ugly brown or something. So, like, you had to think about those things probably when you were picking your dresses, right? Like, what colors are going to actually stay nice the longest, right? These colors are also very difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to make. Blue had long been a popular color for many, many years, and up until the mid-Victorian era, it was usually made through the use of indigo. And this knowledge was brought by enslaved Africans to the Americas. They had a long history of working with indigo. They knew how to not only make the dye, but to make it take in the cloth, how to fix it. And what's interesting is that we shouldn't be surprised, of course, but it's a story of exploitation, right? In the mid 1700s, this daughter of a slaveholder who is a botanist, and she starts playing around with the indigo plant and figures out that the slaves on her father's plantation can help her with using it as a dye. But guess who gets all of the credit for that? Eliza Lucas, the slaveholder's daughter, right? So she is still being credited today. She's still talked about today, but her hands weren't blue. She didn't get her hands dirty with that indigo crop, right? The enslaved people are the ones who brought that knowledge to America and allowed blue to be more used in the fashion of the day. Blue was one of the most popular colors of the Victorian era and allowed it to be cheap enough to actually be affordable because it's being made from free labor.
Yeah, that's one of the things I find super interesting is that something becomes discovered, right? When other people have known how to do it forever, and then that thing gets exploited. There are a lot of West African countries that people were kidnapped from and then brought to the US. Ghana, Togo, Benin, a lot of those countries, even today, they still have a lot of traditional fabrics that have bright blues incorporated in them. That knowledge didn't go anywhere, right? So if those people were taken and then brought to the US and then told, hey, there's this crop that we need you to work on, they're going to say, oh, this? Yeah, I know what this is. They probably hoped that this might give them some extra benefit in some way.
Right.
Maybe if I do really good with this, I'll get freed after this. And so you can see that knowledge by a crop that begins to flourish. It does really well. It increases the demand. And unfortunately, the cycle just becomes this big catch-22. The indigo is so beautiful and so durable that the demand increases. More people get exploited for it. And then more people want indigo, and it just keeps going and going.
Right.
Fun fact, indigo was also one of the cash crops of colonial Louisiana. A lot of people think it's cotton. And by the time of Louisa May Alcott and Little Women, it is cotton. But that was really something that was sort of brought in by the Americans under French and Spanish rule. Louisiana wasn't too interested in cotton just yet. They hadn't really gotten the hang of it. Things like indigo sugar was definitely, we talked about that in our Regency era video. They tried their hand at tobacco, but really indigo and rice were two very large supply crops. And it's interesting because those are two things that were grown in Western Africa for quite a long time as well. So it's again that thing of how convenient, right? The
Yeah,
people that we're
exactly.
exploiting may have a lot of knowledge in this area. Doesn't that just work out nicely, for us,
Right.
the people doing these?
So all of this started to change, not the story of exploitation, sadly, But as far as colors and ties, began to change starting in 1856. William Henry Perkin, a young chemistry student, he was trying to create a chemical version of quinine, which was needed to treat malaria, but instead, his failed experiment created aniline dyes. And so one of the first ones he created was a brilliant purple, and then there was Nicholson's blue. So once again, we see the popularity of blue, and then magenta, which was named after an Italian battle. And so those were three of the most popular colors, bright colors that came out of the invention of aniline dyes during the mid-Victorian era. You'll see dresses that have survived that are still in those colors. People were, of course, very excited about these new bright colors, and also kind of heralded in wearing more bright colors during the Victorian era, more bold colors. Especially in the mid-Victorian era, you'll see it a lot in the 1850s and the 1860s. It starts to fade a little bit more toward the end of the century, but definitely the 1850s and 1860s, they were very excited about bright colors. Now you have the rate of fashion accelerating, right? This is when you see clothing begin to change more rapidly. If you look at the latter part of the Victorian era, the changes in fashion, which we're not going to go over in detail in this video, are very, very rapid. And that was because of all of this. And then now they also have improved printing methods that are allowing them to distribute these fashion papers and fashion plates to the public. And so everybody can see, okay, this is going to be the next fashion. I'm going to try to at least remake what I already have into something similar.
There's that flip side again of technology, right? And same thing with today. This hasn't changed. As we get more technological advances, that's great to be able to make something that lasts, especially now with the sustainable fashion movement. Dyeing fabric and other things can often be just as dangerous. Wouldn't it be great if one day we came up with a way to dye something that was completely natural, wasn't chemically harmful? But turns out to make it, there's probably a bunch of people being exploited to be able to get it out there to the public.
And then we move into how do they actually make these garments? How do they make these elaborate ornamental dresses that got more and more trim and more ornamental as the Victorian era progressed? One of the things that allowed this to happen was the invention of the sewing machine in the 1850s. This had been an innovation that people have been playing around with for a while, but it didn't really take off with a really practical application that home sewers were able to use until the 1850s with the Singer sewing machine. This allowed them to add even more trimmings to their dresses because now we can use our sewing machine to sew even faster, right? The problem is that those that are working in the textiles and those that are working as the seamstresses are not paid or paid well for their work. Obviously, if you're enslaved, you're not paid at all. If you are, like we talked about with the textile mills, and now even with seamstresses, you're not paid very well. And even in the 1850s, Amelia Bloomer was already starting to talk about labor rights. She mentioned that starvation wages were paid to the most skillful and expert seamstresses that she knew. And in 1863, there is this very, very sad story that has been recorded. So we have the marriage of Princess Alexandra of Denmark to Prince Edward, Queen Victoria, and Prince Albert's son. And so there's this huge celebration going on. They're making all of these dresses because, she needs to look her best. She needs all these ball gowns. And this girl named Mary Ann Walkley was 20. She was one of 50 seamstresses that were employed by a specific firm making dresses for Alexandra, Princess Alexandra. And for over 26 hours, Marianne did not get a break. She didn't get to stop sewing. And she started to feel ill, and then she got worse 2 days later. And then the next morning, her roommate woke up in the morning and found her dead in the bed beside her. And there was a public outcry actually over this because the surgeon stated that her death was probably caused by the long hours of overwork and that it was most likely a stroke that had killed her. And when they talked about it in Parliament, there were a lot of people that drew comparisons between what happened to Marianne to slavery. I would argue that's not the same because she still had choice. She still was being paid however little. But they did come to the conclusion that she had been worked to death.
making beautiful ball gowns, right? Like it's always the ugliest conditions behind these beautiful clothes.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. This makes me think about our previous video where we talked about the conditions in what is today Haiti on the sugar plantations and how those enslaved workers were literally worked to death. And the idea was, well, we'll just get another one. Yeah, it's not the same as slavery, but there's so many parallels in this story. And I wonder if Marianne's family got any kind of compensation for her death.
Given it was
Maybe, probably
1860.
not.
Yeah, I have my doubts about that.
Probably.
And even
Yeah.
people didn't experience death from the work. There was a lot of other issues. Anybody working in the textile mills would breathe in the different fragments. It would cause breathing issues, respiratory issues, because they started work so young as children. There was this anecdote I read that was really sad. They would become disfigured because they would have to crawl around on the floor or be in these weird positions for hours, and they'd been doing it since they were 6 years old. And this one guy, he was an inspector, I believe, and he went to a textile mill and he said, I want you guys to bring out all of the people you have, all the workers you have that are disfigured in some form. And he said, within a matter of minutes, there were 80 people in the courtyard in every shape of the alphabet, which is just really sad to think about, and I mean, these are people, they can't stop working because this is literally how they're eating every day. There was also, of course, the effect on education, right? So young girls' educational prospects, this is specifically talking about the United Kingdom, before the 1870 Education Act were very, very bleak. Most of them did not get an education because they were put to work instead, maybe in the textile mills, maybe in agriculture, seamstress work, domestic service. Even after the education law, there's the problem of enforcement. And there was a lot of girls that still slipped through the crack, right? If your mother passed away and you had a bunch of younger siblings, who's going to take care of those younger siblings? You are. You're not going to go to school. You're not going to go to work. You're going to take care of those siblings. You're going to take your mother's place. It wasn't until the late 19th century that they started in the UK forbidding a lot of these young children working. And surprisingly, even to us today, like the ages are still surprisingly low, like 8 and 10, or limiting your factory shifts only to 10 hours a day. What? Right?
Yeah.
Like, still ridiculously low standard. And like we talked about in our first video, many women couldn't afford to be these beautiful ornaments just sitting at home, right? They're having to go out there and work, and they're working from a very young age. And so women in the later 19th century started saying, you know what, we want equal pay. We're tired of getting paid half or a third of what a man would get paid for the same job, right?
This does present several problems for the Victorian mindset, right? If women are supposed to be ornamental, idle, or at leisure, but then on the flip side, we have so many women who literally can't, even though that is the societal expectation. The way the Victorian society dealt with them by saying, well, those women aren't really women. They're so mannish. We're going to put them into a category that doesn't allow them access to womanhood and the few privileges that are there, which is like not being worked to death. That would be nice. The downside is for these women who are working in factories, sometimes since childhood, for enslaved women or domestic servants, right? Women who really worked, they were working as hard as a man for less pay and got no societal privilege for it. At least men, people can say, well, you're working so hard, you're supporting a family, and got paid more with the expectation of there's people that this man is supporting at home. There must be.
Right.
Right. So that was the idea of giving men this bigger wage. Well, okay, but women are proving that they can do that same work and are getting none of the benefits for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the crazy thing is that the men in parliament, the men in power of the day, when women started agitating for equal pay, they said, no, we don't want to do that because we don't want them to work unless they absolutely
Yeah.
have to. We want them to be at home, just like you were saying, right? And so if we only pay her low wages, then she won't leave her home and her husband unless she absolutely has to.
That's what I was thinking. I was thinking this doesn't, I mean, it does sound like patriarchy, but it also sounds like they're afraid of a little competition.
Yep.
You know, if you can get a woman who will do the same job at half the price, what do we need to hire this man for? You
Mhm.
know? Like
Absolutely.
that, we got to get those women at home. This is not good.
Yes. And so not only do we have all of these issues, right? You've got the health issues, you've got the low wages, but also the fashion of the day was not conducive for women who are working in these situations, right? They are getting injured because their skirts are catching in a factory machinery, right? They're catching fire while they're working as a servant in the kitchen. And the really sad thing is these women who are working in these textile mills can't even afford to have nice dresses that they're making the fabric for, right? They're having to rely on the used clothing market, which was a very big thing in the Victorian era, which maybe one day I'll be able to go into that. It's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, it reminds me so much of hearing about these stories of factories overseas today, where you hear about, maybe they'll do an expose on a factory and you find that children are working there. And
Yep.
it's just so sad. Sometimes you hear that the children are making children's clothes.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those things where it's like they can't even afford to buy some of the little t-shirts that they're sewing or things like that, in place of going to school and just being a kid, and they don't even reap the benefit of, well, maybe I can afford this one day. No, you can't.
Yeah. One of the things that I found that was super interesting and once again reminded me of these issues we're still facing today was a poem. It's called The Song of the Shirt by Thomas Hood. This was published in Punch in 1843. For a little bit of context, if you don't already know, the Punch was a satirical print piece. I believe it was like a newspaper or a magazine. I can't remember which one. And this is what this poem says. I'm just going to leave you with this poem. It is not linen you're wearing out, but human creatures' lives. Stitch, stitch, stitch. In poverty, hunger, and dirt, sewing at once with a double thread, a shroud as well as a shirt. So make sure that you have watched our other videos in the Fashion is Political series, especially if you're passionate about these issues. And thank you so much for being here with me today, Ayana.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a good time.